Hey,
Hi.
everybody. Welcome tonight. I'm so glad you joined us. I'm with a friend, colleague, and mold expert. We're going to talk about, you can see in her background, I'm going to here, break the mold. Tonight, all about mold and mycotoxins. Dr. Jill Crista. Jill, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been so excited for this conversation.
It's funny. I've been reading Dr. Krista's book, and I kind of laugh, and I talk about this with other guests. It's so funny because when I read through other people's books, I realize that fundamentally we're talking about the same things, in terms of how we get healthy. So whether you've been affected by mold or mycotoxicity, Lyme disease, autoimmune
Mhm.
disease, MS, I mean, there's sort of these foundational things that are essential to us getting well. And I'm glad that you kind of highlighted a lot of the same things in your book. And we'll dig into some of that tonight, obviously very specific to mold and mycotoxins. So why don't we just kind of kick it off and talk a little bit about, I think we need to differentiate a little bit about mold allergy and mycotoxicity because they
Yeah.
are different and they affect people in different ways. But why don't maybe just kick off a little bit and talk about, what is mold?
What is mold? Mold is our great decomposer for our planet. It has a very important job to take living material that has died, so was alive and now has died, and it's supposed to turn it over, break it down, and make it nutrients for our soil for the next generation of living things to grow from. And that works really well outside, and that works terribly inside. Yeah, because outside there are other natural factors that are keeping a balance on things like sunlight and air movement and the whole fungal family, the mycelial network that is beneath our soil that Paul Stamets talks about, or Stamets, how I say his name wrong. But, there's all these control features and functions that keep mold as part of a well-functioning microbiome of our soil, but it gets into an indoor environment and it doesn't have all those features. So it has no sunlight, it has no movement of air, so there's stagnation, and none of the grounding forces of nature to keep it in check. So it starts to become a bad actor, very selfish and very defensive. And like any of us, and we're learning this from COVID, when you're disconnected, you can get into fear, and when you're in fear, you can become more aggressive than you or naughtier than you normally would be, not your highest self, so to speak. So yeah, mold in an indoor environment starts to act really competitively, and it tries to gas bomb out all of the other microbes that want to grow in that space. And
Yeah,
that's
it's
where we
funny.
get hit.
Having gone to school at Bastyr, outside of Seattle, our school was adjacent to a temperate rainforest. And I can remember walking through the forest on breaks, and you would just see mold everywhere because really sunlight didn't get through the canopy of the trees, and it would
Mm-hmm.
grow on the bark. You'd see it on the ground. But as you mentioned, I mean, this is nature. I mean, this is supposed to be there. Mold actually serves a practical purpose, at least in
Mm-hmm.
the outdoor environment. It's
Absolutely.
it's just when we're dealing with the indoor stuff, that's where we tend to run into problems. So maybe
Yes.
talk a little bit about, so mold's all around us. I don't know if there's anywhere in the world you can live that doesn't have mold, right? I mean, it's pretty much
Correct.
everywhere. Even
Correct.
in the desert, they get
Even
mold.
in the desert. Yeah. I mean, this species has been around long before we were. So it has survival figured out in every environment you can even think of. Even in the Yellowstone hot springs, those mineral springs, there are species of fungi that live there. So, they can survive at all kinds of different climates. The reason why we have certain ones that we are affected by is that we have attracted the species that likes the kind of environments we like in our indoor spaces.
Right.
So, you take a human, no matter where we live, if it's Alaska or Florida, you're going to control your indoor environment a certain temperature and, a certain humidity. I hope people are controlling their humidity
Yeah.
so that, our respiratory passages feel better at a over 50% humidity. And these certain molds like that same temperate climate as well, and they thrive very well. And we're confusing it. We have a bunch of dead material we build our houses with. And so mold moves in and says, oh, I'll get to work, and it just starts doing its thing. But, you brought up a great question about mold allergy and mycotoxicosis. So just because you've gone to the doctor and they've tested you for mold allergy and said, nope, you're fine, no problem with mold, that only accounts for probably 15% or less of all mold illness. So there's spore illness, and then there's toxin illness. And
Right.
that's what I'm trying to really redefine the definition of mold illness, to try to expand it beyond spore illness. Because if you look at the CDC, their description of mold illness is only spore-based things. Well, if
Right.
your building material, if your spores are trapped behind building material, the only thing getting through that building material are the toxins. You never interact with the spores. And that's where we're really seeing a lot of the mycotoxicosis. So it's the mycotoxins, those gas bombs, that make it into the indoor air. They ride the fine little particulate, basically poison your air, and you could be getting mycotoxin related illness and never have an interaction with the spore.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I listened to Dr. Shoemaker, many, many years ago, who really focused on mycotoxicity. I think the big thing too, if people understand, is that mycotoxicity is dangerous.
Yes.
Mycotoxicity can kill you, where mold allergy is a nuisance. You can get symptoms, you can get allergies, you can get congestion, but rarely does anyone die from mold allergy. But mycotoxins have been associated with severe respiratory distress, death, and really very serious
cancers. Yeah.
Cancers, a lot of neurological impairment. So there's a kind of a famous story in that people, depending on what your age you are, you may or may not remember, but Ed McMahon, who was Johnny Carson's sidekick on The Tonight Show back in the day, they had a botched job in their house from the plumbing, and the plumber, whatever they did in the house, with the pipes were leaking, and so he and his wife got very sick and they almost died. And what's really interesting is they had a big lawsuit against their insurance company, because their insurance company basically said, that's not our problem. And so they sued their insurance company and they won. And as a result of that, every insurance homeowner's policy put a rider on now that says we don't cover mold because of that. So not only did you not win the Publishers Clearinghouse $1 million sweepstakes, now you got this rider on your policy that you don't cover mold. But we've had instances like that where people have had, this unknown water damage in their home that eventually led to very serious illness. So maybe walk us through a little bit, how are people getting exposed to mycotoxicity?
Oh, it can be all kinds of different things. I test everything now because I'm just super curious about this. So common places would be roof leaks, basements. Where I live in the Midwest, people hang out in their basement a lot, and so there's a lot of finished basements.
Right.
The inspector that I work with and have worked with for a couple decades, she has said there isn't one basement that she hasn't found mold. Now, is it mold to the degree that it's going to be causing illness? Maybe, maybe not, but still they're breeding grounds. I am not a fan of finished basements. Anything made with a flat roof, those are just, so you think schools, hospitals.
Yeah, like every school.
Every commercial building. Yeah, so that's why we see a lot of problems at schools, hospitals, these kind of places. I actually just found Chitomium, which is a mold that makes a mycotoxin that goes through the blood-brain barrier and can cause dementia. I found that in 3 refrigerator filters. Not that were necessarily expired or that had been in too long, but 3 separate in 3 different houses, Chitomium found. And after I posted that, I have a post out there called "Drink Ice Water, Get Dementia," because it's making your ice. And then people that are doing a lot of ice, like you go work out, and if you fill a big bottle with ice, to go cool off, you're basically making yourself more toxic drinking that. So when I posted that, somebody wrote back in and said, I'm in water treatment and we're seeing a lot of problems with that mold. So I was like, whoa, this is, so baby toys from the bathtub, if they have that little air hole in the bottom, it's a great place to grow some mold. Keurigs, CPAP machines.
CPAP,
not just,
I was just going to say that. I'm like, CPAPs have got to be a common, and look how many millions of people use a CPAP for, sleep apnea.
I know.
And that tubing, I had a CPAP very briefly and I couldn't stand it. I stopped using it, but I could see very easily how those internal components, because a lot of them are plastic too. So they've got the right material to absorb some of those mold and mycotoxins that kind of stick to the walls, and they don't get flushed out very easily.
Right.
Gross.
Yep. It's so gross.
Remember Sophie the giraffe?
Yes.
Children's thing. I don't know if you've seen the videos. I did a presentation on mold not long ago, and there's a bunch of YouTube videos of people who cut Sophie open because of these kids. It's a teething toy, and so the kids are slobbering on it all day. And when you cut open the inside, the entire inside is just covered in mold because that saliva gets inside the toy. It's moisture. It's dark. It's damp. There's no airflow, and over time it starts to build up mold. Well, now these kids are basically squeezing and sucking on mold every time they put that toy in their mouth. So bath toys, we found, remember the package? Well, they still have it, but I think it was whoever makes, I think Apple Tree is that the name of the company, but they make like the applesauce in a package. And
Oh,
they actually got sued because they found that there was mold growing inside those prepackaged apple sauces. And again, there's a bunch of YouTube videos out there if you guys want to get really grossed out and see
oh
it.
my
And
gosh.
so as a result of
There.
that, that's why now that I think they're required when they make those packages, they're clear on the bottom so you can see through it, because before you couldn't see through to see that there had been mold accumulating. So obviously they had a problem in their manufacturing process. It was allowing mold to get into the food product, and that
Hmm.
would just start to fester over time. Once they seal it up, cut it off from oxygen, again, just a good breeding environment for food and
That's
mold, or
right.
mold and food.
Hmm.
So again, I think we don't realize that you get exposed to mold not just in the outdoor environment, but you get it through food too, right?
Yeah. And in my patient population, of course, everybody has a selection bias of who comes to see them. And even before I was known as like the mold lady after, before writing my book, the people that I would see that had most illness were not necessarily foodborne illness. It was water damage building exposure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's been my
Because,
experience as well. I mean,
okay,
and I know
interesting.
when we test people, we'll talk about that in a little bit, that it's not always easy to know whether it's food derived or environmental, although there are certain mycotoxins that certainly are disposed to being environmental over food. But I would agree. I'd
Mhm.
say that 98% of the people I see with mold illness are from the environment and not necessarily from food.
And so, yeah, when I test people, I take them off like the classic mycotoxin contaminated foods for 3 days just to get that limitation of the test out of there, if at all possible.
Yeah, you want to rattle
Yeah.
off what some of those foods are?
Absolutely. The ones that are mostly contaminated are going to be the things that we mass produce and mass store and that are a good carbohydrate source. So we have corn, that's a biggie. Peanuts. I haven't met one peanut yet that's not mycotoxin contaminated. I've been testing them because I really want to find, some good food sources.
Even
All
the organic
grains,
stuff.
even the organic stuff.
Wow.
And actually, I hate to say this, but especially the organic stuff.
Yeah.
If you can find more locally grown or small batch, then that's going to be a better deal. That's across the board for all these things that I'm talking
Yeah.
about. That doesn't mean you can never eat corn, or you can never eat grains, or you can never eat potatoes. But if you know your grower and you're getting it pretty close to when it was actually harvested, then your chances are pretty good it's not contaminated with mold. Like in my area, we're corn central. When you drive down it doesn't take me long. I'm like half a mile or less from the edge of town, and then it's just cornfields as far as the eye can see. In the fall, when they're harvesting that, they just put it in a big pile on the ground, and if it's raining, they just throw tarps over the top as if that's gonna. And then they take it right from there and put it in the silos.
Yeah.
Soaking wet corn that's been sitting on the ground wet, and put it in a silo, and it sits there. And so other contaminated foods are from the feeding of animals, of their moldy feed, because these mycotoxins are fat soluble. They're going to accumulate in the fattier tissues. So that's where we get into trouble with butter, dairy, eggs. So that's going to, if those animals are being fed moldy feed, then you're going to get it in the animal product.
Yeah. So what are some of the symptoms someone might experience if they've been exposed to mycotoxins?
Well, like
I
with
know it's a
Lyme.
long list, and we've only got a little bit of time, but
Yeah. So
let me
it's just like,
rephrase that. What are some of the more common symptoms you experience?
well, like with Lyme disease, it's like it can cause any symptom in any system of the body. So there are some cardinal things that are related to mold, but they're also related to Lyme. And so often I'll have someone fill out the Horowitz
Yeah.
MSIDS questionnaire, and then I design my questionnaire after his for myself in practice, saying, okay, and once I discovered that so many of these people with Lyme that weren't getting better had mold, now how do I determine that a little earlier so we don't have to, do all this crazy stuff and have them sick so long? So commons, which are going to be common for both, are going to be fatigue. That's a big one. We don't see a Lyme patient that doesn't have fatigue either. So,
Exactly.
same thing. You're going to be seeing something with the gut usually. And then something neurological. So whatever their neurological weak point was, their Achilles heel, whether it was sciatica or a neuroma in the foot or migraines or numbness and tingling or something like that, then we're going to see that worsen. So it might not be that they never had that in the first place, but it's going to get more extreme. And then, we can see something to do with that neurological also could be ear ringing. I see that very
Right.
commonly. Interstitial cystitis is one we see a lot with mold, because the mycotoxins, as you're peeing them out and they bump into the wall of the bladder, they're damaging the wall of the bladder and they cause nerve irritation. Same thing with irritable bowel syndrome. You're going to
Right.
be seeing, not only are you getting nerve problems, so you don't get peristalsis, so you get this kind of skip shot, consturia, as one of my patients calls it. But you also have this, so you can have motility issues that cause SIBO. We see SIBO a lot. But you also have the damage to the mycotoxins on the lining of the gut. So you can see actual ulcerations of people that look like they have ulcerative colitis from mold exposure. Yeah, it's crazy. Some of the quirky ones, pelvic pain. And then what we've learned from Dr. Horowitz is we don't really see the migratory pain like you would see with Lyme
Right.
disease. So that's a nice rule out for people. If they're like, do you think this could be mold or Lyme? Then I usually say, well, do your symptoms migrate? And if they say no, then I'm like, okay, more arrows are pointing toward mold. But if they say yes, then I say more arrows are pointing toward Lyme.
Yeah, when I talk to my Lyme folk, I'd say maybe 85% of the symptoms associated with Lyme disease we see with mold illness as well. So there's a lot of clinical overlap, and we've been going down that path of treating Lyme, and people aren't improving. I'm at the point now where I try and get mold right off the bat. Let's at least evaluate it, because it can save us a lot of time and energy if we kind of hang our hat that everything's a tick-borne illness, when in fact we come to find out you've been exposed to a water damaged building. You've got this body burden of mycotoxins that hasn't been addressed because fatigue, brain fog, neuropathy, sleep disturbances, all these kind of things. There's just so many symptoms that it's really hard to tease out what's related to one thing over another. So it's good, if you guys are suspicious that you have mold illness, it's good to talk with your practitioner about testing right up front. Even if you have Lyme, even if you have some other condition, this may be compounding the problem. And again, it can save you a lot of time and energy if you know that up front, because it's going to take you down a very different treatment path than just dealing with, a tick-borne illness. So
exactly. Yeah. And that's our whole premise, find and treat the cause. And so if you're chasing after a different cause, not that Lyme isn't there, but in some cases it is the mold that is creating the barrier to getting better. And if anybody wants to check it out, if they're like listening to the symptoms or have been suspecting it's mold, you can go to moldquiz.com, and I have a little quiz there that will tell you if it's sounding like you have a mold problem or not. So it gives you a good kind of little tips, and it's educational as you go through. There's explanations about why that question is there, why that symptom is being asked about. Oh, and I forgot to mention anxiousness. I don't know that I have had a patient that with mold problems that hasn't had some level of increased anxiousness. And I'm really careful not to say anxiety, because that has a connotation of like panic disorder or something you need medication for. Most of the time what I'm seeing is an anxiousness that is a very internal experience that people will, on the outside, they look cool as a cucumber, but on the inside, they're just like, something's not right. I'm not safe in the world, and so it's expressing as sort of an inner restlessness.
Yeah. And I saw this a while ago when I was in Connecticut. We had a local grade school that had a roof that was leaking, and the town didn't want to spend $100,000 to fix the roof. They ended up with a $42 million new school because Stachybotrys was so invasive. They literally had to raise the building. They couldn't even fix it. No. But several teachers and students had, migraine headaches, again, the brain fog. The kids, the one things that came up when talking with other doctors in town was like behavior problems, mood disorders. All these kids were depressed. And again, it's just so odd for kids in grade school to have these things we typically think of affecting more adults. So for kids who might have exposure, it might look a little bit different than what you see in adults. But when you start to see your child who is normally, behaving well and doing well in school, and all of a sudden they're not doing well, they're struggling to focus, they're not completing their assignments. Again, for me, that might be a red flag, just because schools, no matter where you are, again, I never understood, how can you be in Wisconsin, Connecticut, where it, gets this white fluffy stuff called snow, and have a flat roof building? It just accumulates. And, with the best of construction, I don't know that there's a way that you can truly seal a flat roof.
No, I know. I don't understand the flat roof idea, how that even was an idea, anyway, I'm not a building expert, but I don't get it.
Just be aware, schools. I had one patient that had a lot of, again, very vague symptoms that kind of fit the mold thing. She had her home tested. As far as we could tell, the home was clean. And then it came out that she went to a church in her town. The church was 400 years old. And she would go in the basement once a week to do volunteer work. Well, the basement, they come to find out, was just loaded with toxic mold. So even that exposure once a week with their volunteer work, and she probably spent an hour or two there, it was enough that it was producing these pretty significant, health effects, particularly with their neurological system.
Absolutely.
So your exposure time, we always talk about with any environmental toxin, right? It's duration, time of exposure, length of exposure, the type of toxin. So, you may feel like it's not that much. What is a safe level of mold exposure?
0.
Zero.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's not.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you said that because, again, I've seen people, and I've heard even other practitioners, when people bring their mold report and they go, well, you just have a little bit of Stachybotrys and it's in the other room.
No. And the thing is, okay, first of all, they're carcinogenic. I have to say this over and over and over again. And the mycotoxins, what's that?
That means it causes cancer.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. These cause cancer. And they cause immune deficiency, and which leads you to be more susceptible for autoimmune disease. I mean, these are bad dudes. If they weren't, militaries around the world wouldn't be stockpiling them for biowarfare. When I get the comment of like, well, I'm sensitive, but my husband isn't, or, mycotoxins affect me, but they don't affect my husband. I'm like, if they didn't, then militaries wouldn't be using them as a weapon. Like you said, it's about dose, duration, susceptibility, type of toxin, all those kind of things. So is everybody affected by mycotoxins? Yes, every living thing, including pets. Does it take some people more time to display those symptoms? Yeah. And some people less. And that just has to do with all those factors we just talked about. Nutritional status, definitely. How many methylation and detox SNPs you have, all these kind of things stack up. So for some people, it, like you said, the 2 hours a week can tip them over the edge. And for some people, they can live in the environment for a few months before they even have one tiny little symptom.
So you mentioned genetics. I want to bring this up because this comes up a lot with my patients who've read Dr. Shoemaker's work, and he talks about the dreaded gene.
The dreaded gene.
The dreaded gene. So there's a certain HLA DQ genetic profile that he purports disposes you to more mold illness. My clinical experience has not corroborated that. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I don't find the dreaded gene is the dreaded gene at all. And I see people who are very mold ill that don't have any of those genetic variants that he talks about, and vice versa.
Yeah, I would say I see the same thing. I think the body has so many other backup pathways that even if you're not tagging that mycotoxin as a bad dude, your other systems will figure out that that's a toxin and has to be detoxified or dealt with. And usually it's dealt with, if you're actively being exposed, it's dealt with by tacking it on, finding a place to stash it. And usually that means in fat tissue. And when you're a normal human and you say, oh, they're fat soluble, so you think love handles and that kind of thing. But as a doctor, we know that fat soluble means bone marrow, brain,
right,
organs, every lining of every cell, every lining of every mitochondria in our body, the lining of the nervous system. So that's why they start to display the lining of the gut. Just outside our gut is just all kinds of fat to protect us, to protect our vital organs. So as a doctor, if you start to think about, fat soluble, it just breaks it down to be a very simple answer. And like I said, the genetic thing, what I've seen be the most important genetic factors are how well a person detoxifies.
Right.
Because it's a toxin illness.
Yeah. Well, like you said, I think people forget that we have, multiple pathways that we get rid of various toxins. I don't think there's any one pathway that we clear everything. And, I think MTHFR tends to get all the press. I have people come in, oh my God, I've got an MTHFR mutation. I'm like, right. But that is one pathway out of, a lot in which we get rid of things. Methylation is one way, but there's sulfation, there's a glucuronidation, there's all the other ways that we're able to eliminate things. And I think with few exceptions, there are other ways that the body backs that up. So one genetic SNP by itself doesn't mean a whole lot. You have to look in the totality of everything. And again, your genes are what they are. We can't change them. You were born with them. They say, what is it? If, the genetics, load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. So it's really about environmental control. So talk about environmental control. If someone suspects that they have mold in their home or their workplace, what is the best way to evaluate whether there's mold there?
Call an expert. You and I went to a lot of school to know what we know. And these building people did the same thing. Yeah. We wouldn't want the building guys to start treating our patients. their body, and so that's the thing is that, I am such a big fan of calling an expert who this is their life's work. Let them be your advocate. This has saved my patients hundreds of thousands of dollars, having someone that's there to defend them against insurance companies, lawyers, landlords, bosses, all of those things. So I really am a big advocate of making sure you're using experts to help you with just the whole process. There are now with COVID, there's these really cool innovations that are coming out where they're getting, there are different ways that you can kind of do partial DIY testing, but you're still being led that, the person that's driving the boat is still a building expert until they can get back into houses. Yeah, so I hope that's not a cop-out answer, but I really
I 100% agree. I think one of the things I've run into with different mold inspectors is that they're doing different testing methodologies.
Oh, yes. I'm glad you asked
maybe we
about
can talk a little bit about the different types of testing available, because I think people need to understand, when you're calling a mold inspector, you want to know what they're doing. Because I have literally had patients tell me they called the mold inspector who walked around the house. They opened up one plate for, where's the camera? They opened up a plate for 10 seconds, capped it up, and went and said, okay, I'm done.
No, that's a terrible inspection. And I am a big fan of a class called Mold Master Class. It's all about building inspection and then remediation. So I have a couple rules of thumb. Your remediation company should not be your testing company.
Right.
They need to be different.
Conflict of interest.
Massive. So if that is happening, that's a red flag right away. The random air sampling we're talking about, the plate thing, first of all, the auger that's used only grows out 10% of indoor toxic molds. It does not grow out Stachybotrys. So when somebody's like, whew, we did a plate and it didn't show Stachy, that's because that doesn't grow out Stachy. It doesn't grow out Willemia or Chaetomium or some of these bad dudes. So why would we run a test if we're only getting 10% of the picture, first of all? And then a random air sample is far too vague. It's so many compounding factors on making that a good or a bad test. So did someone just open a door? Did someone walk across the carpet? And so you're actually getting a falsely elevated level. There's so many different things. But the most important part of an inspection is right here. The eyes. An inspector should go around and do a full, thorough look at everything. And Brian Carr, who does the class Mold Master Class, he also has these wonderful posts and things on his website that say, and he has a little guide for people who are thinking of renting. Here are the top 7, or I don't remember the number, but it's signs that there was water damage. And it's little things like looking for rust on certain things, and looking for water stains, looking for bubbling, checking below you talked about where in the building, checking below every place where water goes through a house. So below sinks, you should be able to see below a sink and then see if there's been drippage. Because if there has, then that means it's probably gone where you can't see, in the space that you can't see. So a good inspector will do a typical single family home should take that inspector 2 to 3 hours to go through.
Right. Yeah, I had a patient out here where they have a daughter with autism, and we were suspicious that because they at home, she was a basket case. When they left the home, she was better. So when you hear about getting better when you're away from your home, again, red flag, there's something in your home that bothers you, and a good chance.
Something.
Come to find out, they had a leak behind their kitchen sink. And what was really interesting, when they ended up taking the kitchen cabinets out, the lower cabinets, the whole back wall was loaded with mold. What was happening, though, is the water was leaking. Instead of coming forward, the pitch was such, it was leaking out the back of the building. But we live in California where it's warm. So as soon as the water dripped out, it evaporated. Now, once they went back, they could see where there had been water. But if you were just to walk around the building, unless you caught it at the moment, when the water was turned on, you wouldn't necessarily see the dripping. So that water had eventually kind of spread out through most of the back wall, but it never made its way out to the front cabinets where the people living there could actually see it. And I've seen, pictures and videos of people who they look at their walls and they look perfect, and they peel back the wallpaper, and behind the wallpaper, which was a great moisture barrier, if there's behind it, you may never know it was there. So the visual inspection is hugely important because there are clues, but we have to go a step beyond that, because you may not
Absolutely.
necessarily see the problem that's causing the mold issue.
So every type of testing in a building has its strengths and weaknesses. And the idea is you're trying to just put together a picture. Same thing with how you test a body. I don't rely on just one single test to say yes or
You
no.
don't?
Mold. Isn't that weird? Yeah. I mean, everybody says, well, you only do the mycotoxin test. I'm like, okay, I talk about it a lot, but I've been really remiss in telling everybody about, I have a whole panel that I'm looking at. Even before there was mycotoxin testing, I was testing people for mold. It was just all these little, what are the impacts, like the shadow of mold? And so mycotoxin testing has been nice because it's helped me have more of a, when symptoms go up, mycotoxins go up, and vice versa. When, we get the mycotoxins down, symptoms tend to go down. But that test has its limitations. So, you put together a full picture, natural killer cell function testing, white counts, liver enzymes, the whole thing. We need to see the whole picture. Glutathione and oat test, all these different things.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other types of testing? So if you're calling a mold inspector, so there's the random plate testing, which I think we all agree is not terribly effective.
Mm-hmm.
There's spore trapping.
Mm-hmm.
So spore trapping, is when they come in what looks like a little fan, and instead of blowing air out, it sucks air in. And usually they'll do it room by room. So what's nice about that, again, is that it's getting a larger volume of air, a slightly better representation than just what's randomly floating by the plate. And then it traps it into a cartridge, and then they take that cartridge and then they plate it out. So you get a little bit more of a yield. Plus, with that method, you can actually see what species potentially are there. And now, again, they're plating out more just the agar that doesn't grow Stachybotrys and Chaetomium. These will actually grow out all the different species. And what do you think about the ERMI test?
Yeah, I like the EMMA because you're also seeing mycotoxin. So that you're getting the trouble with mycotoxins. They're also the same with the body. When we see a positive mycotoxin, we don't know is that a was problem or a now problem, which I'll explain that in a little bit. But in the building, the nice thing about an EMMA is it's an ERMI plus a mycotoxin. So it sort of correlates. You can try to correlate anyway what you're seeing in the building as far as the spores. And then if you're seeing really high like trichothecenes, which are from black mold, Stachybotrys, but you're not seeing that on your ERMI, then that could be a forensic discovery that there was a mold problem, but the people cleaned it up and it weren't disclosing, that kind of thing. So I like that combination. And then spore trap, I've seen, and again, I'm not a building expert, but I've seen that be more effective in cavities than rooms. So you are using the inspector, they've got their infrared camera looking for water. Then if they potentially find moisture behind a wall, then you drill into that cavity and you do a spore trap from that cavity. Spore trap from a random air sample it's better than the plate, but it's still a random air sample. You still have this massive room with so many cubic feet of air, and you're just taking this one little, balloon full of air. So I think cavities and smaller spaces are a really nice use of spore trap.
Yeah, and if you guys haven't heard of an ERMI, it's the Environmental Relatively Mold Index, and that's from dust samples, right? So you collect dust from around the entire house, and then these mycotoxins can stick to the dust, and then from that they create a log scale, and really anything I think that's considered over 5 is significant for mold. So I think it's -10 to 20, right? Is the scale on it?
Yeah. That algorithm that they're using is a little faulty, because what if you live in a really moldy outdoor place? It compares, your outdoor to your indoor.
Yeah.
If you live in a really moldy area, it could falsely represent health in your indoor building. So I think it's really important to look at the species that you find. And again, if you see some of those that are really thirsty molds that are indicators of a pretty extensive water damage, like Stachybotrys, like Chaetomium, like Wallemia, then we start to worry about, even if we're only seeing 2 spores, if you're seeing that and you live in a moldy outdoor environment, then, you could really you could have a mold sick person definitely on your hands. So just looking at the species is important as well.
Yeah, and a little bit of toxic mold, again, it's like being a little pregnant. I mean, you are. So there's no such thing as a little toxicity. If you're toxic, you're toxic. And that's probably a red flag that you need to, I mean, my feeling is if someone has particularly toxic mold exposure, I mean, you gotta leave, you gotta get out of the building. The longer you stay there, the more health impact it's going to have you and your whole family. I mean, again, especially if you've got kids, kids' brains are equally susceptible because, your brain's a big glob of fat. These things
Yep.
again, like fat. So it's one of those things, as inconvenient as it is the safest way to protect you and your family. Get out while you're getting the remediation done. And let's talk a little bit too, because I know this is, I think, a bit controversial in the mold world, or maybe it's not, maybe just in my mind. I hear a lot of people say, once you've had a mold contaminated building, you need to throw out everything you own that was in that building. You can never clean it, and throw it out.
Tricky. And again, that's where I rely on those inspectors, because the coolest thing that our inspector locally has is this little microscope. So she can actually go and test your couch, and she can test your curtains and your rug and your mattress and that kind of thing, and see if there are spores and fragments there. So that I think that's it depends kind of answer. The sooner you go, the more stuff you get to keep. That's for sure. So, that's another argument for getting out soon. Like, just accept that this is the problem and then get the heck out. And when I say get out, that doesn't mean like necessarily never, walk away from all your stuff. That just means get out, during remediation. And sometimes I've had my patients actually box up everything in plastic bins, seal it with tape, get it out of the house. And then as you feel better, because of course remediation is only remediating spores and fragments, it's doing nothing for mycotoxins. So you have to do the extra cleaning of get the mycotoxins out of your built space, which I've used all kinds of different things. We've pre and post tested different things. I have a all-purpose cleaner on my website. People are welcome to. I've had the most success with people who literally did a wet wash, which is tricky because you're adding moisture, with dehumidifiers following close behind. So wet wash, dry, dehumidify, go to the next room, seal that room. Wet wash, dry. And so you basically have to take everything out of the house, which is a lot of work. But the things that haven't been easily remediated are mattresses, because we sweat out the mycotoxins when we sleep. We breathe them out while we sleep. Upholstered furniture. Every time you sit down on it, air squishes out. And every time you lift up off of it, it goes. And so it takes everything up from the air in that environment. So those are two definite places where we can see spore invasion. And then, of course, things that are more natural have more of a problem. So leather, cotton, and which is, we see patients that are all natural, right? This is also the things in our patients' homes. Glass and metal seems to be just fine. Things made with real wood, you have a little better chance of keeping, because there are natural resins in that wood that help prevent. But again, I'm going to put a plug in for that mold masterclass. I have a discount on my website for it, because I contacted the creator and I was like, this is the class I wanted 15 years ago when I was first specializing in mold. So
and we'll post the link in the notes.
It's so good. And he has this whole algorithm of stuff, what to do about stuff. It's just great. It helps you just decide, like, okay, there's a piece of furniture, but it's an antique. How, the worth itness of trying to remediate versus replace and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I found the same thing. I think, glass, metal, and again, most wood, because there's usually a finish on it, a lacquer that actually is a barrier. So it's not just raw wood that's as porous. The things that are porous, that's where we have a harder time. I've had some success with some people who've ozonated the products and have been able to bring it back. And I have other people who've tried it, and they bring it in and they start twitching and have all sorts of symptoms. So I think it really depends. But I think we're both in the camp that, no, you don't have to throw out everything you own.
No, you don't. And, that's a little dangerous to say, because then people take that as an excuse of like, oh, I don't have to get rid of anything. And, even myself, when we had mold in our house, I kept way more than I should have. And I ended up making my car sick. So, it's a tricky thing. It's this whole negotiation you do with yourself of like, oh, I've lost so much stuff. And maybe this will be okay to keep, but is it really worth feeling cruddy? No thing is worth that.
Exactly. So, okay. So for home testing, we've got different methodologies. So the EMA, again, is kind of a newer test. I mean, when the EMA first came out, maybe the last 5 or 6 years, as far as I'm aware. So you just need to talk to your mold inspector about which methods they use. Again, you want to know up front. And again, I think at least inspectors that we use out here in California, they don't do just one. Usually they'll do 2 or 3 different ones, because like Dr. Crista said, we're trying to paint a picture of what's going on in your home. And there's no one way, I think, that encompasses all of the different things that can affect the home. So it's good to get different tests, different perspective. And around here, anyway, the charge varies a lot. I've seen anywhere from $500 to $8,000, depending on how much work they do. So it's depending on the size of your home, how much, if they're doing like crawl spaces, areas that are basically difficult to get to, and it takes them a longer time. So understand there is a pretty wide range depending on where you live in the world, what they charge. But look, this is your health. This is your family's health. And if you're suspicious, you got to know, because the sooner you know, the sooner you can fix it, the sooner you remediate it, the sooner everybody gets healthy. So
that's right.
It's just one of those things that I think we would both agree that we don't really want to skimp on, because the long-term effects of this can be pretty dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like skin cancer, the longer it goes, the more damaging it is, the deeper into the tissues it goes, so to speak, the deeper into the stuff. And if you can just get on it, even just the smallest hint of, I think this might be a mold problem, act on that right away. If the people that have done that have saved themselves thousands of dollars and years of illness.
Yeah. So let's talk about, so that's the building. Let's talk about the person, because we can test your home. We can find out that there's a mold problem, but we want to know what's going on with you, the person. So how do we evaluate people to find out whether they've had that exposure?
Well, I don't like to spend a lot of money on testing if we don't have to, because we have enough that people have to spend on treatment. So, that's part of why I created this clinical questionnaire, because, we use questionnaires for other things like irritable bowel disease and, dementia and that kind of thing. So if we can do it with a score on a questionnaire, then we don't really have to test somebody, because then we can measure that score as you go through time. And I have found that to be the case, that the questionnaire has been quite reliable for me in practice. I did put it in my book so that people can get it. If you want a downloadable PDF, just email me through my website. I mean, we're just I'm trying to get this out there, use the questionnaire. And I'm working with practitioners to try to scientifically validate it, so it can be something where we can really minimize the cost of testing for people. So then the evaluation is really just looking at the person, the history, doing a good physical exam. Naturopathic doctors are fantastic with this. There are so many little signs and clues on a body that point more arrows toward mold kind of things. And it doesn't mean you have to have a fungal infection. It can mean something like POTS, where they have unstable blood pressure. Right. So there are different things like that we can see. Respiratory changes, lung changes, that kind of thing. And then for labs, I try to stick with, if they have insurance coverage, as much as I can do through insurance. If they have histamine issues, our colleagues, Dr. Talia Farshan and Raj Patel, they have found a connection between MCAS, or mast cell activation, and MMP9. So they're using that as sort of an indicator. So if there are histamine issues, I might add an MMP9, but I'm definitely running things like a CBC, a chem panel. I want to see their cholesterol numbers, because often we will see an LDL rise and an HDL drop, and that just has to do with that liver toxicity and fat solubility of the toxin. And then a natural killer cell function. I might run a red blood cell glutathione to see if it's one of those people that's they can't even drive 50 feet behind another car because that's too close. The exhaust is too much for them. I'm chemically sensitive. Okay, let's find out what your glutathione status is first, because if it's really in the tank, this excretion test of a urine mycotoxin test is probably not going to show us the truth.
Right.
So we might need to do something to boost their glutathione naturally so that they can show us their truth on a mycotoxin test. So again, but if we know it's mold, I don't even test. I just go into treatment unless there's something. I mean, I'm an experienced doc also, so I know the sort of things that I probably need to hold together. But there might be, if I'm going to do nothing else and I know it's mold, I might do a glutathione just so I know how much we have to push.
Yeah. So are you doing urine mycotoxin testing on your patients?
Yeah. Yep, I do. And I have a prep sheet that I have them do certain, the mycotoxin free kind of foods for 3 days so that we're taking that limitation out of the test. Yeah.
So there's a couple labs that offer urine mycotoxin testing. I mean, for a long time, it was Real-Time Labs. They were the only player in town.
Only game, yeah.
Since then, Great Plains offers urine mycotoxin testing. They do test for slightly different mycotoxins. The methodology they use is a little bit different. It's not that they're better or worse. They're just different, like every other lab test out there. I know for a long time, Great Plains was stating that not to do the glutathione challenge prior to testing with real-time labs. And the reason we use glutathione is it basically helps mobilize mycotoxins out of tissue, because it's like squeezing the sponge, right? We want to get it out and then see what gets excreted in the urine. Well, the methodology that Great Plains has, apparently they say glutathione interferes with the test methodology. Now,
that's my fault, by the way. Because I have twins. I have identical twins. So I can do experiments on an identically similar, same lifestyle, same house situation, which is highly unique situation. And I put one on glutathione and one not, and tested split sample, sent to real time into Great Plains, and saw that the glutathione really did affect the numbers on the mass spec method that Great Plains uses. And Vibrant uses that method as well. Vibrant is doing more mycotoxins right now for the same price as Great Plains. So, it's an ever-changing field. So, I just have to stay on top of it. But yeah, so if there's someone who can't be off their glutathione or they get really sick, then I use real time. So there's positives and negatives for every test and reasons you would do it. And my doc course, I talk about that, like what are the conditions, if they have kidney disease, the mass spec, they control for creatine and, or creatinine, but in the ELISA method, they don't. So that actually might be a better test for you, because that person's creatinine levels might be too low to get an accurate test with the mass spec. So there are different things that we, looking at your patient, always look at your patient.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have gravitated towards Great Plains just because of the price difference. Real time is about $800 for the test, and Great Plains is about $300. So it's a significant savings. But again, you need to understand, what you're getting. I know a lot of docs I talked to, they didn't feel like the glutathione was interfering. I'm on the conservative. I actually will do glutathione ahead of time, have them take a day or two off, and then try and get some out of tissue.
Yeah.
Because it should be far enough away not to interfere with the test, because it's the direct glutathione, and glutathione is metabolized fairly rapidly. But once you start mobilizing out of tissue, I don't know what the length of time it'll stay in the system, but there is a time period. So hopefully we'll catch the right window. But that is another way to potentially approach that test if you still want to do a little bit of a glutathione challenge, but you don't want to have to worry about it interfering with the test.
That's a nice compromise. And I like what you said there. A lot of doctors feel that it isn't. How do we know until we test? And that's why, that's where I took advantage of having twins who both lived in a moldy house with me and messed around, with the things that we did before the test. And I think the onus really is on the labs to create the lists of confounding factors. We know this for vitamin C. We know this for lots of or glucose, that vitamin C can mess up a glucose reading. Why don't we have this for this test? And I think the onus is really on the lab. And I did get interest by a couple labs that were like, okay, let's do some testing. Let's find this out and get enough people so that we know, because that could just be my own kids' genetic SNPs that's causing that. It could be lots of things. But I definitely am doing other patients where we're doing split sample with, some people in the house using glutathione, some not. And I'm just seeing that consistent thing that some mycotoxins are going up and some are going down with the mass spec. And so it just gives us a really confusing picture, I think.
Well, and you alluded to it earlier, and I see a lot of similarities when we're doing like heavy metal testing. It's the same kind of problem, that some of these mycotoxins have a strong binding affinity. They don't mobilize well. Some people are just poor excretors, whether it's their genetic SNPs or otherwise. So it's very easy to do this test. And you'll see, I've had some patients, I had a great example. I had a mother and a son that lived in an apartment. We know the apartment was tested, loaded with toxic mold. So two people, same exact environment, same relative genetics. I mean, it's a mother and son. We tested her levels were through the roof on her urine test. Her son, on the other hand, was 0 on every single mycotoxin. I mean, 0. And I'm like, that's not possible, because we know he had exposure. So my interpretation is that he's a very poor excretor, and he was also the more sick of the two.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have the capacity to eliminate these toxins, your body accumulates them, but we're trying to, yank them out, and they just don't come out. So again, read everything with a grain of salt, and just because it says 0 doesn't mean you haven't had exposure, unfortunately. If you're a poor excretor, but again, I tend to do the test to have some sort of biomarker to measure kind of where we're at, what kind of things we're dealing with. But like I said, we treat people, we don't treat labs. And
Yeah.
I love the idea of using the questionnaire. I mean, Horowitz, validated his Lyme questionnaire.
Mhm.
Glad you're doing that work. And if we could have a validated questionnaire, it will save a lot of time and effort. And then we have got something that people can very easily take over time to monitor their progress instead of keep doing lab tests. Very easy to fill out a questionnaire and see, do the symptoms get better? Because ultimately, that's our guide on how we're doing.
That's the point. Yeah. And, we do have cases where people are living in a moldy environment. Some family members test positive, some test negative, but they're like healthy-ish. They're the people that are excreting so well, they're detoxifying and it's going into the bile and they're pooping it out. It never has to spill over into the urine. So I think it's one of those things that I think, you also, like you're saying, take it all with a grain of salt, but look at your patient or look at yourself. If you're the one listening and you're affected by mold or working through this, how you feel really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I said, I used to see this when we were doing a lot of chelation therapy. Some people would chelate for, mercury or lead. We'd see these sky high levels after kind of provoking them, just like we do with, the mycotoxins. And they would go through treatment and they felt no better. And it was just so disheartening. You're like, but your levels are so high. And, the thing is with mycotoxins, just because you have a body burden doesn't really necessarily tell me how it's affecting you. But when we start treatment, and we see your clinical symptoms improve, we know we're on the right track.
Right. Because that may not be the presenting layer that your body needs to be shed first. We could be actually adding stress to your body. And that's the whole protocol. That's all what's behind my protocol is that I'm really trying to minimize the amount of stress we put on the body before we try and get these babies out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of, we got mold. What do we do?
We got mold. Well, we peeled the orange.
That was an onion.
Well, peeling the onion, the way we were trained is that's the way symptoms reverse. But the therapeutic order for mold is the orange, because there are certain things that need to be done 100% in order for people to get better. And I am a believer that you need to, Dr. Crinian taught us the first 3 steps of any toxic exposure are so important. Avoidance is so important. It takes up the first 3 steps: avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. And so, I have so many times when people, and I get it, people are sick. This is affecting their finances. This is affecting their sense of security, or if it's where you work that it's moldy or, whatever. So they will try to negotiate. Do I have to get all the way out? Do we have to remediate fully? Could we just plastic off the area? All of these different negotiations, and
paint over the top of it. That's a
paint
common
over it, seal it. Oh, this remediator call, we checked it out. There's this fogger where we don't even have to remove any of the material, which is junk, by the way. And I shouldn't say junk. It's great for the very, 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 very end where you're trying to pick up the particulate. It is not going to remediate sick material, just like skin cancer. You wouldn't leave it on and just put salve on once and say, fix the problem. Mold is very much like skin cancer. I think of it a lot as similar. And actually, I've had more than one melanoma case where it was related to toxic mold exposure. So I think that there is sort of that kind of, doctrine of signatures almost of a condition. Yeah. So the outer 2 layers, just like how you would peel an orange, the outer orange part and then the white fluffy part, you peel all of that to get to the inside. And the inside is really where the meat of the treatment is, or the juiciness of the treatment. But the outer 2 layers are so important. And the first one is avoidance. And then that white fluffy layer, the second layer in, is fundamentals. And that's everything your naturopathic doctor nags you about, what we call basic treatment guidelines. Circadian rhythm, diet, and avoidance. I do include some dietary avoidance as well, because you can be eating foods that are making your situation worse. And I should now explain colonization. So my perspective is a little different than other people's perspective in the mold world. And that's what shaped my treatment protocol. And it is that once you're exposed to the gases of a indoor toxic environment, just by mere interaction in your sinus passages, and then eventually your gut and your bloodstream and that kind of thing, that first interaction is basically your sinus fungus and bacteria start saying, uh-oh, something's trying to attack us. And so they start acting defensively. And if we tested normal controls and a mold sick person, we would have the same characters in our sinuses if they did tissue biopsies. Everybody has fungus in their sinuses. The difference is the people that are mold sick, their sinus fungus is now excreting mycotoxins. So something happens that puts this switch on where your own internal flora starts to say, we're not safe. We're going to have to start taking some defensive action. So a normal sinus microbiome or sinubiome turns into biofilm, pathogenic biofilm. And then that can go on over time. These mycotoxins are immune toxic, so they reduce your immune system. And now your own respiratory passages don't have the defenses, and then that moldy building can move into you. So it's that whole idea of like the exposure to the moldy environment or the air, just the poison air trips this trigger. And we have to do everything in our power to reverse that trigger back to normal. So people get very sensitive to fungi in foods. So mushrooms, even medicinal mushrooms, which we're supposed to use for immune system.
I know.
It just sends more of that message of, look, see, there's fungus that wants to move into this environment. So I take people off anything that is fermented only because I made people really sick trying to put them on fermented foods. So and that's just the initial. That doesn't mean those are gone forever. That's just while we're trying to get you better. So the dietary stuff is a little more specific than just how a naturopathic doctor would tell you how to eat when it's mold. But, that's part of that whole fundamentals. And then the inner 3 sections are protecting, repairing, and then fighting off the mold. And what I mean by protect and repair is making sure that we've nourished the organs of detoxification, your nervous system, we're protecting it, we're protecting your brain, we're protecting your kidneys. A lot of these mycotoxins cause kidney cancer. So, we're trying to make sure that in the process of killing the fungal overburden in your body, we're making sure that everything stays together.
Great. And let's talk a little bit about binders, because I know this is a confusing thing for a lot of people. And, again, I think our training has been very similar that, we understand that some mycotoxins do better with some binders over another. You kind of need to know. That's kind of like why I like doing the urine mycotoxin test. So I know what I'm dealing with, so I can select the appropriate binder. But maybe talk a little bit about binders and how, what is your process and how you select the right binder for someone?
Well, I think it's so important that we're being really clear about what we're binding. So if we are talking, you had said that the majority of your patients are dealing with a water damaged building, somewhat it is what we're eating. But, the most of the studies on binders are done in animal husbandry because they know they're going to be feeding these animals possibly moldy feed. So in a water damage building situation, that's different. We're not eating the mycotoxins. We are inhaling the mycotoxins and we're taking them in through our skin. So they go from there to the bloodstream. From the bloodstream, they get delivered to the liver to get packaged up in bile, which then gets sent into the tube down to the intestines. And so really what we are binding is bile. And so a lot of people kind of get on me. They're like, you didn't even really talk about all specific binders in your book. And I just say, that's because in most of the cases, if we're dealing with a water damaged building, we're binding bile. I call myself a biolophile. I am so into bile. I have in my doctor course, I have this whole thing called a treatise on bile because it's one of the most underappreciated fluids in our body, I think. So yeah, I'm big time into bile. Bile protects you from coronavirus, by the way, everybody. So all kinds of things. I know that's the V who shall not be named. So the bile is our target. And we've known through all kinds of other toxin-based illnesses that, and studies that are done on people who have lost their gallbladder and that kind of thing, there are lots of studies that show that insoluble fiber is a fantastic bile binder. So you can actually do binding through food. And they've done studies on people that had cholecystectomy, so they no longer have a gallbladder and they're having trouble with bile dump diarrhea, that steamed kale was the most effective binder for stopping that bile dump diarrhea because it bound up most of the bile. And so I start with just food, 5 to 7 servings of vegetables, try to eat every color of the rainbow because each of those bioflavonoids has a specific mycotoxin protective effect. And you're getting a lot of good fiber there. And then add insoluble fibers such as flaxseed, oat bran, rice bran, chia seed, those kind of things. And so, there are, if you also have SIBO, which is the common question that I get in my Q&A is, well, what if I have SIBO? And there are some great SIBO friendly fibers like sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, and they're very high in insoluble fiber. So you're binding, you're getting good protein, you're getting good fats, so you're diluting mycotoxins. and you're doing your binder, and you don't ever have to go on cholestyramine. But I really give Dr. Shoemaker a lot of credit that he really understood that. That's why cholestyramine was his number one tool, because it's binding bile. If you're going to also protect yourself from ingested, that's where you have to kind of then go out into the different things of like charcoal does this, zeolite does that, that kind of thing. But if you're eating carefully, you don't have to worry as much about those specific binders.
Yeah. So if any of you are following Dr. Wall's protocol for MS and other autoimmune disease, because it's so heavy in vegetables and other good sources of fiber, you're probably already getting a lot of that without even thinking about it.
Right.
But, I like that approach that, use food as medicine. But I think there are some people, we do add in different binders. I'd say in my practice, I am not a fan of cholestyramine for 1,000 reasons. I think because it was developed as a drug for people with high cholesterol, for the reasons you just explained, is that it's a bile acid sequestrant, is that it interferes with fat-soluble vitamins much more than other binders and certainly food. It tastes horrible. It's disgusting. The conventional stuff has aspartame in it. There's a million reasons we don't want you having aspartame.
Right.
You can get it compounded where it's just pure cholestyramine powder. It's expensive. Again, I think for all the reasons that you can use it, I can think of a lot of other reasons not to use it. So I think, again, we have a lot of other great natural binders, and whether it's activated charcoal or zeolite or bentonite clay, I think, again, it's something you'll probably have to work with your practitioner to figure out what's right for you. I've used one called G-Pure that I actually like a lot because G-Pure is really interesting. It's a form of zeolite, but what's cool is it's odorless, colorless, tasteless. And so for kids, especially who are really taste oriented, they won't take, most of these other ones, but they can take this. And having done pre and post testing, I've seen changes, and clinically I see improvement. So we've got quite a few options available to us, but having some sort of binder on board, in addition to what you're doing with your diet, I think it just kind of helps expedite the process. And again, the more we can kind of drain the swamp, so to speak, people start feeling better sooner.
Yeah, that's really important. You mentioned the swamp, that in an indoor environment, you're not just dealing with mold. There's a mixed microbial diversity. So you're dealing with endotoxin. You're dealing with bacteria that are also, farting out their gas. And so people do get dysbiosis. And I find that the people that have a lot of gut issues, it's not just mold and overgrowth, fungal overgrowth in their gut. They're also dealing with bacterial dysbiosis. And that's when I like to use like a mixed binder. I've found that when I do have to use I'm going for binding, there are predictable times, like just before I put someone on an antifungal, we need to make sure that we've got some binding on board, because we know there's going to be die-off, and because we use plant medicine that has multiple mechanisms of action, you're also going to be knocking down some of that dysbiotic material. And that's where it's nice to have something that's like an activated charcoal. And really one of my favorites is Takasumi Supreme. It's carbonized bamboo, and that was been showed to be a fantastic binder of all kinds of things. So that kind of grabs the mycotoxins, endotoxin, and they even purport that it snags EMFs. So I don't know, that's written in Japanese. And so I didn't get through the whole study. My sister-in-law is a nurse that she's from Okinawa, and she got through most of the study, but I was like, so what about the EMF thing? She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think they might call it something different in Japan, but that would be pretty cool too,
Why not? One more toxic thing to get rid of that can't
exactly. Exactly.
Well, I think we're coming up on our hour time here, and we got a lot of great information. So, get your environment tested, get yourself tested. I just want to add, I guess, maybe one quick note at the end. We didn't really talk a lot about mold allergy, but maybe just a few comments on that, because again, I will respectfully disagree with Dr. Shoemaker, where he says, it's a small percentage of people with mold illness that are mold allergy. I will argue that mold allergy is actually a bigger problem, because there's more people who have exposure to mold spores than those that have exposure to toxic buildings that have been water damaged. The biggest flaw I think we have is with mold allergy testing. If you're doing skin prick testing or blood testing, that's primarily looking at IgE antibodies. We know from the research that a lot of mold allergy is not IgE mediated. So you're testing for the wrong thing. So this is even sometimes where IgG testing can be helpful, because it's just looking for exposure to the molds. Now, again, if you live in the Midwest and it's summertime, you're going to get exposed to a ton of molds because it's just in the air. So
Yeah.
that may not necessarily be helpful, but when you're testing for very specific, especially toxic molds like Stachybotrys, you shouldn't have elevated antibodies to that unless you've had exposure.
Correct.
So again, it's just trying to help us determine if you've had that exposure. And again, mold allergy is treated primarily with immunotherapy. It's much like allergy shots and things of that nature. We can actually desensitize you to the effect of mold spores on your immune system. So again, very different than mycotoxicity, but there's low dose allergy therapy, there's sublingual immunotherapy. There's a lot of different ways you can use immunotherapy to deal with the mold allergy. And you can be mold allergic and mycotoxic.
Yes.
So again, as you're working with your practitioner, you're talking about mold as a whole, you probably want to go down both pathways, see if you're mold allergic, see if you're mycotoxic, because you're going to do very different things. But, again, there's some clinical overlap and you'll want to know exactly what you're dealing with.
Yeah. And actually it's through my protocol when we do the fight, the last phase of knocking down the fungal burden, so often people's mold allergy gets better. So there is that whole like immune burden that makes them
Right.
more freaking out to anything they see commonly, and especially in that family. So yeah, it's really fun to see that somebody's like, I used to have allergies every mushroom season and now I don't at all. I can be out hiking and have no problem. And I'm always like, yay, we did it.
Well, I think we're taught naturopathic medicine that, again, it's about body burden. It's about total load. This concept of environmental medicine, it's, again, we're talking about mold, but of course it's everything else you're exposed to. It's, chemical exposure. Do you have too much alcohol? Do you smoke? What else? Do you live near a power plant? All these different things add to your total load. And so this is just one more piece of that puzzle. And again, as we reduce that body burden, you get healthier, your body functions better. So it's just, finding all these different ways that we can lower that total load and get you back to feeling healthy again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you know if anybody is doing allergy testing using lymphocyte testing?
Lymphocyte testing I've seen only for food. I haven't seen it as much for environmentals.
That would be so cool.
Probably because there's the MRT labs that do lymphocyte testing. Alcat does lymphocyte testing. I'm not sure if they're doing environmentals. I think there's an inherent problem, though, when you're doing it in vitro. I don't know that it necessarily reflects what happens in vivo or what happens in the person. We know from Alcat testing, there's at least 5 studies that show that Alcat's not reproducible. So I would be concerned about the reproducibility if you're testing for environmentals.
Sure.
But I've seen so many people who've gone to the allergist, they've done skin prick testing or blood testing, and the allergist says, well, if you have no mold allergy, well, every time it rains, it's humid, I get a headache, I'm tired. I mean, they're telling you they're reacting to mold, but it didn't testing. So it just tells us it's a different immune reaction. And again, find an environmental medicine doctor who understands mold allergy as well, and they can walk you through different things to do for immunotherapy to help with that. So, guys, you see it in the background. Again, Break the Mold. I'm going to post the link below for you to get. It's on Amazon, right?
And also one of my favorite. Yeah, it's on Amazon. My signed copy. I just love this. I get into this all the time. I'm always sending people, you need to go get this book because it has a what to do.
Oh, you know what? I want to show this, Joe, real quick, because I thought this was great that you put this in your book. I want to show the healing curve. And, we like to see that slow, steady curve. And in reality, it's that other one that's all a bunch of squiggly lines where that's exactly what happens. So, we like to see every day is a little better than the day before. And in reality, that almost never happens. So you can have the good days and the bad days. So when you have the bad days, you just kind of chalk it up and go, okay, it's a bad day. We're going to move on. So hang in there with everything you're doing for your health. I think our Q&A queue is not working because I have not seen any questions posted. And usually we get questions and comments. So if you guys are tuned in and want to just type into the chat board, just say hello or something to see if it's working. But I don't see anything in my queue. So and we had a few little glitches when we jumped on here. So I don't know, technology is being a little wonky. So I apologize. If you guys have questions, it's not showing up in my queue. So what we'll do is after the broadcast, if you go ahead and post your questions, Dr. Crista and I can go back in and answer them on the Facebook page just to make sure that you get your questions answered. So again, Jill, thank you so much for joining me tonight. We appreciate all the information. It was wonderful. I hope you guys really take this to heart and learned a lot tonight. You got one of the leading experts on mold and mold toxicity. So I'm really grateful that you joined us tonight.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's
All
a real
right.
honor.
Thanks, Jill. Have a great night.